Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about how limitations make for great storytelling and why when you have these quote unquote progressive people writing stories who can't accept limitations, this is partly why, I would say the root of why they can't tell a good story. And the reason why I'm doing this is because, well, I asked everybody to put in the comments where they thought my channel should go in the future. And by the way, just to clear something up, yes, I'm going to continue to do my long form videos on the weekend. It's just the weekday videos that I'm going to change. Right now, they're mostly interviews. I'm going to change that over to short videos and or live streams gradually until we get to summer, when they'll be exclusively that. And then when fall hits again, I'll probably go back to doing some interviews, intermixing all three forms during the week. But anyway, one of the most helpful comments that I got was, well, look, if you're doing all this in order to get more eyes on your books, then maybe you should do some more videos about your own work. And I thought, no, people really don't want to hear about that. But there's always a way to do something which can incorporate both things at the same time. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about really good storytelling with my example of Robert E. Howard, and I'm going to talk about it because these are the patterns of good storytelling that I'm trying to follow within my own stories, especially within my upcoming Conan-inspired graphic novel. And for this entire video, I'm going to include in the background art from my first graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, which is already published, my second graphic novel, which is in production right now, which is The Valiant Heroes, and my future graphic novel, which begins its campaign in about 4 months, which is CROM the Destroyer, which is the Conan inspired book. And the links for all of those are in the description if you want to click on those and go over and see if my graphic novels are for you. But the point is, I'm going to go over that is Robert E. Howard's great way of dealing with some elements of story as an example of what I'm trying to do with my own books, which is an example of how to use limitations to tell a great story. So I covered the base of talking about my books. I covered the base of people who are here because they want to hear about how to create a good story. And then I'm going to move on into discussing what people who are here for the philosophical part want to listen to, which is why you have progressive, quote unquote, progressive people who can't tell a good story because they can't accept limitations. So I ran across this really good page on YouTube recently, about 6 months ago. It's called The Cybrarian. Basically, he takes old Robert E. Howard stories and he makes basically a radio play dramatization out of them. Not too heavy on the dramatization. It's mostly narration, but it's really good. And I wanted to go back and read some of these Conan stories, but I just didn't have the time because, of course, writing the script for CROM the Destroyer. So instead, I found this, and it's a good substitute so that I can listen to these stories while I'm doing other things, and that way it doesn't take away from the very little amount of time I have for myself. And just to be fair, I guess I will link the Cybrarians page in the description if you want to go over there and listen to some really good narrations of stories, which some of them are fairly short, especially for the Robert E. Howard stuff. It's about an hour and a half. And as I'm listening to these Robert E. Howard Conan stories, which again, I have not read or been exposed to in various forms for probably a couple of decades now, that's probably when I originally read these stories, I noticed something extremely complex within his writing. Now, I don't particularly like Robert E. Howard as an individual, I'll tell you that right up front, but who really cares about that? It's about the man's writing. And I'll say that I don't think that he is an expert writer according to the most prominent science fiction and fantasy writers. I think he's a little bit underneath that bar, but he does do some things expertly. And that's really, I think, the appeal of his stories. He knows his limitations, and he uses those limitations instead of ignoring them, instead of trying to obscure them, he purposefully uses those limitations to make his stories better and to make them appeal to his audience better. Which, I guess, if I put it another way, would mean that I don't think he's a master storyteller according to the linguistic side of the entire thing, but I think that he knows enough and can use enough to be a masterful storyteller in the storyteller part of presenting a story. So it would be the difference between form and matter, logically. He's fairly good on the form. He's an expert on the matter. And I will give you, again, 3 examples of this from his work, sometimes using direct examples of his work, which again, I try to employ some of these things when I tell a story. So, number 1 is the fact that he describes things in a very unique way, in a way that you will not see today. Now, this is partly because of the situation in time where he is at, but I would say partly because of the influences that he has on him where he was reading things, I think, when he was young, which would be, to some extent, it appears to me, classical mythology, but of course, a whole lot of Celtic mythology, which comes straight through within his works, which, of course, is the origin point of characters like Conan, because he's literally a copy of an old Celtic myth character with a couple of elements thrown in from different characters from Celtic mythology. And this is actually something that I would say I probably grew up on the same kinds of stories, reading the same kinds of stories that he did. And not just grew up, but even for the last, I would say the last 20 years, 15 of those last 20 years, what I did almost every day just for fun was to go back and read some ancient Greek mythology and then put down that book and pick up ancient Celtic mythology, and that's what I would do for my fallow time that I had in my day. And I read those books over and over and over again because they were so enticing. And the most basic way that I think Robert E. Howard uses limitations in order to better his story is to look at the limitations of language itself and incorporate them into the story, especially with his limitations of telling short stories, so he has to use limited descriptors, and find the best way to do that in order to convey to the reader's mind what kind of picture he's trying to paint. And the reason why I was talking about mythology just a minute ago is because I think that he is influenced a lot by things like classical myth, where you see in Homer this turn of phrase that's used over and over again. There's a handful of them, and I think you can see the same thing within Robert E. Howard's books. The reason why originally in Homer this happens was because the story was not written down. It was a verbally told epic poem, and they needed to have these key memorization markers, which was usually a turn of phrase that they would use over and over again. Things like the wine dark sea or the rosy fingered dawn. And although those ancients, like the people who took Homer's story and then carried it on until it was written down, were using those in part in order to memorize the story so that they could tell this epic poem, I would say that when you see Robert E. Howard, he's using that same technique to use these very interesting descriptors, but for a different reason. His reason, again, is because he had limited space in order to tell a short story. And so what he does is he paints a picture using the fewest words possible, and he does so in an expert manner. So to give you one example of this, and I'm doing this from memory, so forgive me if I don't get it exactly right, but there's a story, and I don't remember which one it is off the top of my head, but it's about this jungle island, and you can forgive me if I'm confused because there's more than one about a jungle island. But the scene that he is setting is, before Conan gets there, he's describing the island. And the island is being described in the early morning, and there's a heavy dew on everything, even the trees. And so how does he describe this scene? Again, he's using a short story format, so he has to cram this in with as few words as possible. And he does this by saying, if I remember correctly again, the dew-jeweled leaves. Why does he use that descriptor? Well, because again, it's morning, there's a heavy dew on everything, which is what happens in the morning. That heavy dew is hanging off of the leaves of this jungle, making them shine in the sun as if they were jewels. So again, he takes everything that I just explained and puts it into 3 words. And he does this constantly, especially in the first act of what he's doing, because he usually has a beginning, middle, and end, which are fairly set. So he tries to set this scene in the mind of the reader, and he's doing so, again, expertly, using as few words possible because he's limited in the amount of space that he can use because he's telling a good story. And I would say at the same time, he's limited by language use itself. And he uses those limitations in an expert way. If he didn't have those limitations to begin with, he might have just become a lazy writer who would use a half a page to describe this entire scene instead of using 3 words. And the second example of this that I want to go over from Robert E. Howard's work is connected to the first, because it's connected in a way wherein he gives the reader just enough information for their mind to grab onto the picture or the story and then run with it. That, again, is an expert way of telling a story, and it is something I try to do within my stories itself. I'm not an expert at it like he is. Within my first graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, people said, I have questions about this, this, and this. And I thought to myself, well, you're supposed to have questions about this, this, and this. Why? Because I want you to ask those questions of yourself. This is, to me, a sort of interactive storytelling. And again, it is something that Robert E. Howard does masterfully. And he does it not just within the language, but within the structure of his stories. Because the structure of the story, again, usually it's beginning, middle, end. And the thing is that in the very beginning, he sets up the scene within this world of Conan. Then he starts to follow Conan, and you follow this character through the remainder of the beginning and then through all of the middle and the end. And this is where I would say that he incorporates some of his knowledge of Celtic myth. I've talked about this before. Celtic myth is very odd if you try to read it as reading a normal story that you're used to today. It isn't. Our normal story pattern is based off of Aristotle. It's based off the Greek. It's not based off of either the Norse or the Celtic. Those have very different structures. For the Celtic myth structure, it is one which it is following a pattern, I would say, just like their other art, their visual art, where you see these pattern of intricate knots. What is that? That's a forest. That's tree branches. They're all knotted together in this old growth forest. And this is where their storytelling goes as well. You have a central branch which is starting off, and then it goes like a branch of a tree to an offshoot, to an offshoot, to an offshoot, to a leaf, and that's the end of your story. So you start off with this main part of the story, which you think you're going to follow, but you don't. You go on this sidetrack, which then leads into another sidetrack, which then leads into another sidetrack, which then completes the story. And you're going, wait a second, what about all those other parts of the story? What about all those other characters that you started with? Why did we end up here? They ended up there because they're using the pattern, as far as I can see with my analysis of Celtic myth, this pattern that also goes within their visual storytelling, which is art, of following tree branches. This is the kind of way that their minds work in a time and place where they're surrounded by these old growth green forests that pretty much cover everything. But Robert E. Howard, he incorporates some of this without going that deep into that kind of storytelling. He still sticks to the beginning, middle, end format of an Aristotelian Greek way of telling a story, but he leaves enough offshoots for you as a reader so that you're thinking about these things after you're done reading the story, thinking to yourself, oh, I wish he had gone down that track and told me more about that character or what happened to this situation and then that character. But he doesn't. He leaves that up to your imagination. And to me, that's the best form of storytelling and the best form of hooking an audience. Because if they're constantly thinking about these other parts of the story, which go with unanswered questions, but are not technically part of the main story, so you keep this main core that has a resolution, so you're not let down there, but you're thinking about these other parts of the story and wondering about that world, that gets you into a mindset of, I want to read more of these stories. So the point is that he gives you a story of Conan. He starts by setting up the scene, then he brings in his main character, and then you follow that main character through this world and through his adventure until it comes to a close. But at the same time, there are so many things going on in the world around him that you would want to explore if you had the chance, that you become enthralled within the world itself, and those questions are left unanswered for the reader to fill in the blanks and think about themselves. And this, again, is working within the limitations that he has within writing short stories. He can't write this giant epic that he can tell all of these little side stories and then flesh out this entire world. He just can't do that. But he gives the reader just enough so that it is completely enthralling and intriguing and you want more. And, by the way, not only is this using limitations, but this is trusting your audience and their imagination so much so that you're respecting the people that are reading your story, expecting that they have the wherewithal to answer these questions or think about these questions themselves. That's why I think of it as, again, which what I'm trying to do at the same time, as interactive storytelling in a very old form. And the third way that I want to talk about this, and the third example that I want to give, I think is the largest example of this for me anyways. And I'll talk about one specific story because it's one of my favorite Robert E. Howard stories, which is The Scarlet Citadel. And here is where we see Robert E. Howard using the limitations of working only with text. So it's something that I can't do specifically because although I did work on a novel manuscript, which I still have and hopefully will get published, right now I'm working with comics and graphic novels, which are primarily visual. Therefore, you take a lot of visual cues. You can't hide the details within simple text. But he, using just text, is telling a story which does so masterfully with the use of text and what he does not say. So, light spoilers if you've never read The Scarlet Citadel. The middle part of the story is where Conan gets put into a dungeon. And this dungeon is supposedly, because we don't know, our narrator is not all-knowing, all-seeing, and we get other characters giving hints of this is the case, but you never know them exactly to be true. But they point towards the fact that this dungeon within which he is put has only two exits. One, the normal exit to the Scarlet Citadel, which is held by the wizard that he's trying to defeat. And two, you can go down and exit into hell. And Conan learns this because he can't get out the normal way, so he tries to go downwards. And then he meets some horrific things. But these horrific things, again, are not described in great detail. They're described just enough so that your mind can grab a hold of what you've been told and fill in the blanks with the most horrific things that you can think of. Quite honestly, I'm not a big horror fan, but I know enough of horror and I've watched enough and read enough horror that I can say positively that of all of the horror stories out there that I have encountered, I would say that this part of this adventure story within the second act of The Scarlet Citadel is probably better at being a horror story than 90% of the horror stories out there. And it's all because of the unknown aspect and the limited amount of description that Robert E. Howard gives within his storytelling. There is one creature that Conan encounters that he describes in a very thorough way because it's something that your mind would be used to. But then when he gets into the more fantastical, we'll say, aberration forms of things that exist down farther within the depths of this dungeon, he describes them only to a certain extent, and again, then leaves it up to your imagination to fill in the blanks. He does this, in part, again, because his narration is not from a all-knowing, all-seeing aspect, so there are questions that you can constantly ask yourself, you can constantly second-guess yourself going, this is what Conan thought, but is it right? This is what the wizard said, but is it right? And you can go in 100, 1,000 different directions with where this might be coming from and where it's going to. And again, it's part of the story that he leaves specifically up to the reader's imagination by not saying certain things. And again, this comes from a place of limitation. He does not have that much time nor space to tell this story. He's telling short stories. He's limited by how much description he can put in there, and instead of bucking that limitation, instead of resenting that limitation, he takes that limitation and he turns it into a positive. For visual storytelling, which again is partly what I'm trying to do right now, and is the way that I would say the earlier Marvel comics within the John Buscema era of Conan the Barbarian and then the Savage Sword of Conan, tried to incorporate the same thing in visually by using a lot of silhouettes, using a lot of negative spaces, and using them in very creative ways. Which again, I myself am trying to incorporate into my CROM the Destroyer story as well. I have a limited amount of panels that I can use per page. And instead of bucking this, instead of kicking against the goad, I think to myself, okay, how can I use this limitation in order to put down into the story exactly what I need? And sometimes I do it with negative spaces. Sometimes I do it with silhouettes. Sometimes I do it by incorporating a silhouette into the side of the panel gutter. These kinds of things are all expert uses of this form of storytelling, which I'm simply employing. I didn't come up with these. I'm using the key reference points that John Buscema and Roy Thomas used within their storytelling of this character, which I would say is informed by this negative space, as it were, within the use of language that Robert E. Howard uses within his storytelling. And again, I have to point out that for all of these, they need to incorporate not only an acceptance of limitations and then using those limitations to better the story, but it is the use of those limitations that must also accept that your reader has an interactive part to play within reading the story itself and can understand. So you give them a bunch of credit as being a reader. You have to have them understand exactly what is going on here. It is up to them to fill in the blanks. And so your writer is in effect saying, I trust you, the reader. I respect you, the reader, enough so that I can tell the story in this way. All right, so now that I'm done geeking out about Robert E. Howard stories, let's move on to why, quote-unquote, progressive people can't write in this way. And I think you can easily see right off the bat why it is. It's because they can't accept limitations. They think of limitations as being evil without actually using the word evil or calling them evil, because that would put a limitation on your descriptor of the thing, limiting it by the ideas of good and evil. And I've discussed the reason for this before, so I'll go over it briefly here again. It is not just progressives who do this and think this way. I think there are a lot of liberals who are not progressives who think in this way as well. And to be fair, I think there are a handful of people who call themselves conservatives who do this. And it comes from the corrupted liberal ideal. And what do I mean by this? Well, for millennia, the idea of liberty is the freedom to do what was right. And you develop what is right and what is wrong by whether it's in accord with reality or not. Now, we might have some discussion after that about what constitutes reality and how it plays out, but at the very least, you're accepting the limitations that you can only do certain things in order to be free. And this, by the way, is expressed within the very heart of the American project. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which I've talked about so many times, this is an expression of natural law, and it is very specifically put down that way. Why? Because if you don't have life, you can't have liberty. And at the same time, you can't have liberty unless you're drawn forward by the third thing, which is expressed as the pursuit of happiness. And the pursuit of happiness, as I've said over and over again, is an expression of natural law, which is to say that you, as a human being, have limitations of being a human being with a human nature, and in order to fulfill that human nature, you have to work with that human nature and the reality of it, and the reality of things around you and how they interplay with that human nature in order to be happy. And that's the only way that you can technically have liberty, which is to say, again, liberty by having the freedom to do what is right. Because again, what is right is expressed here as the pursuit of happiness because it's an end that is placed upon you. It's got nothing to do with what you choose of yourself. It's part of who you are as a human being, not as an individual. Although you can choose your individual way to fulfill this. But the point of what liberty means for these quote-unquote progressive people, and I would say a mass of some of the liberal thinking individuals, is that liberty is not that old definition. Liberty is I get to do whatever I want to do whenever I want to do it. That is to say, liberty is do what thou will. And this is a contradictory statement if you're saying that liberty is do whatever you want to do. Why? Because if you try to do whatever it is you want to do, you're going to make yourself less and less free by not acknowledging the limitations of you as a human being and the limitations of reality around you. Again, why? Well, it's because if you try to do something that is contrary to reality, either the reality of your own existence or what is around you, then you're going to make yourself a slave to error, and you're going to have a burden placed upon you by reality itself, smacking you to the ground saying, you ain't doing that. I'm going to punish you for doing that because you can't work outside of the rules of reality. That's how reality works. Again, this is enslavement to an erroneous idea. So, in essence, in defining liberty this way, they're actually pursuing their own enslavement instead of liberty. And this mindset is that limitations, any limitations placed upon you, even if they're by yourself, are in effect evil. And again, I say in effect evil because they don't use that word, because saying evil would put upon it limitations of good and evil, which again, they deny any limitations at all. Now, I want to give you two examples of this, one that's old and one that's fairly recent, in order to flesh out this idea before moving back to storytelling. How can I say that these people, these quote-unquote progressive-minded people and others like them, think of liberty in this way and think of the rules that are imposed by anything, which are limitations, are actually oppressive and therefore evil? Well, there's a horrific example of this from Germany within the last 50 years. I don't think it ended until, I think it was the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, and I did a video about this, and others have as well. It was the idea, and this was coming straight out of the government of Germany, that they wanted to stop people from becoming fascist by doing what? By taking the most innocent and helpless of children, that is to say orphans who had lost their parents, and putting them in the care of people that they specifically knew that would abuse them in multiple ways. And that's as far as I'm going in that description. And why did they specifically do this to these children? And do so again, I think it was up until the late 90s, maybe even into the early 2000s, because their idea was that fascism comes from rules. Therefore, in order to combat fascism, what you need to do is to take very young children before they develop any real ideas of rules, put them in a situation where the most forbidden rule, which is the protection and care for innocence, is violated over and over again, so that they see rules as something that really don't exist, because even the most inviolable rule can be violated. So rules are nothing that actually exist in reality, and therefore, in their minds, they would grow up to be people who did not subscribe to rules and were therefore never going to become fascist-minded people. This most horrific of experiments, by the way, led to many suicides of these children, because that's not the way people work. And rules are not evil, because once again, their idea of evil, label it fascism, and therefore you don't have to call it actual evil, because once again, that will be placing limitations on it, and you can't do that. And by the way, if you're looking around at North America right now, at all of these things that are trying to indoctrinate young children into through their school systems and everything else, this is the exact same experiment. Ensure that the children do not grow up to be fascists by violating the most inviolable of rules in front of their eyes and with them there, if not participating in it over and over again. And the second thing I want to bring up, which is something much more recent that's going on right now on the internet, so if you're not listening to this when it just came out, then you might not know exactly what I'm talking about, but there is a movement of what they call trad wives, where they have women who want to be traditional wives for their men. And you have these feminists which are blowing up saying, this is wrong, you can't do this. And people are asking the question, well, isn't feminism all about choice, so that you can choose whatever it is you want to do? And these women are choosing to place themselves in traditional roles. How can you say they can't do that if it's all about choice? You're saying that their choices aren't real, that they don't matter, that they're actually wrong. Therefore, how can you hold this seemingly contradictory two ideas in your head at the same time? Well, they're not contradictory, because the base idea is the fact that liberty and freedom come from the progressive, that is to say, the growing denial and destruction of any and all kind of limitation. So again, at the heart of it is a recognition that liberty and freedom coming from doing whatever it is you want to do, and therefore limitations of any kind are evil, you must progress by destroying more and more of these limitations. And this is what your modern feminism, quote unquote feminism, is, because it is saying that the freedom and liberty that they are fighting for is only true in so much as it leads to the destruction of more and more limitations. If you have these women who are choosing, that is to say, through their own free choice, choosing to place more and more limitations upon themselves because they think that will make them happy, well, that's wrong. Why? Because it doesn't ascribe to the base understanding that limitations are in themselves evil. And by the way, you can apply this to anything. It doesn't have to be this trad wife situation. You can take anything that has happened within the last 10 years and apply this same standard to it and see exactly what is going on. Like the fact that it's all about freedom of choice, but if I choose not to take a certain medical procedure and instead put limitations on myself so that I don't have to do that and just do a whole bunch of other things, well, that's wrong. Why is it wrong? Because I'm accepting more and more limitations on myself. And if you're accepting limitations instead of trying to destroy them at every turn, then, well, you must be a fascist, of course. So at its heart, it's the difference between how people define liberty. If liberty is I get to do whatever it is I want to do, or liberty is the freedom to do what is right. And if you ascribe to something like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, although you never heard of my definition before, it's the same thing. If you agree to have limitations placed upon you and think that you can be fulfilled by those placing of limitations upon you, then you think about liberty in this old way, even though you don't know my definition, which is really the ancient definition. So let's take all of that and go once again back to storytelling and show why you can't have a Robert E. Howard type of storyteller anymore, certainly not within your quote-unquote progressive sphere of normal mainstream entertainment. Why? Because he accepts limitations and uses those to better his story. But if you're a part of the quote-unquote progressive system, you ascribe to progressive beliefs, limitations are the enemy. Limitations are evil, and you must find ways to circumvent limitations at every turn. And to give you an example that, yes, this has been deliberately implemented within some forms of entertainment, I usually go back to the words of Sana Amanat about when she was talked to come and join Marvel Comics in 2009 and was then fast-tracked in order for her to change the entire way that comics were made. Again, these are her words. This is exactly what she was doing. She was implementing this quote-unquote progressive ideology onto the storytelling when she eventually became the vice president of character development and content. Again, this is the destruction of the limitations that were there placed upon that form of storytelling. They must all be gotten rid of. Gotten rid of, by the way, at the same time as getting rid of that old audience. And there was an old video that I did around the first of my channel. It was bizarre to me at the time, but now it kind of makes sense. It was a video that came out from Marvel.com itself when they were doing all of these ridiculous shorts on the internet and these little programs. They don't do them much anymore, but it was a program, and it wasn't for children either. It was talking about, in the rest of the program, about museum exhibits and things like that, yes, had to do with Marvel Comics, but at the same time, these were not topics for children. And part of what they were concentrating on this video itself was to teach people how to read a comic book. And I thought to myself, this is utterly ridiculous and bizarre. How do you need to teach people how to read a comic book? And I'm talking about very simple things, as in you read from left to right, from top to bottom, from page to page. This is what they were trying to teach their audience. And why? Because A, they're trying to attract this new audience of quote-unquote progressive people, and such people have been indoctrinated into this progressive liberal ideal, this corrupted liberal ideal, so much that they cannot or will not accept any limitations at all, even ones that I would say little children could understand. And no, I'm not trying to use a every schoolboy knows fallacy. I'm saying that, hey, for me, this is the way things went. And if you're a comic person, raise your hand if this happened to you as well. As a child, I read comic books, read quote unquote comic books, before I even learned how to read. And in part, I learned how to read by reading comic books. How many of you have had the same thing within your life? Raise your hand if you did. My hand is raised. I know my friend John over at John's Long Box. His hand is raised. He's standing there amongst his giant basement full of comics with his hand up. And I would say most probably 90% of the people who are here for comic content would also be raising their hands. And that just goes to show that children, even before they're at the age where they can understand to read, can understand the simple limitations, which I admit are Western civilization limitations, of the fact that you read from left to right, from top to bottom, from page to page. I don't care if you read a majority of manga who reads the opposite way in some regards. You can still, I would say, understand when you pick up a book that it goes from left to right. Except these people who run Marvel at that time were saying, no, our audience can't understand that. Why can't they understand that? Because the destruction of limitations in their mind has brought them to such an infantile state that they can't accept or recognize the simple limitations that even children who don't know how to read can automatically accept. And this is why, and my example is comics, but it can be used for other mediums as well. But for comics, this is why now you get comics that have 3, 4, 5 pages of nothing but block text for the entire page. And this is a visual medium. Why in the world would you do something so stupid? Why? Because having it only as a visual medium that has these certain limitations are limitations. You have to work outside of those. You have to break those limitations. This is why you might get an entire splash page of just 2 people standing there talking with giant word balloons everywhere. This makes no sense within the context of writing a comic. But they think they can do so. They think they're pushing the boundaries because they can't accept those limitations anymore. So what you're left with, at best, within these quote-unquote progressive stories, is a garbled mess. But if you take a couple of steps in the progressive direction beyond that, it becomes not a story. Why? Because a story, again, with its definition for millennia, is a representation of reality. And here's the thing with representing reality down on a page. It doesn't matter what medium you're in. You could do it on a screen as well. You have to understand, as the creator, as the writer, that you are not God. You have limitations. You cannot describe reality according to how it actually exists. So you need to understand that limitation and allow your audience the respect so that they can fill in the blanks where you're not actually going to be able to put down everything that describes the reality. But that's one massive limitation on your ability to tell a story. So they move outside of this limitation and then into something which is not technically a story. It is a diatribe, a panegyric, an apologia on their way of thinking, their political ideology, or anything else that benefits them in destroying more and more of these limitations. So, what's my point in going over all of this? Well, I think I have a twofold point for both sides of my audience. Number one, if you're someone who just wants to argue with these quote-unquote progressive people and show them that, well, you know what, you're not correct in the way that you actually view the world, one of the most infuriating ways that you can get under their skin and to show normal people that you're actually being a rational individual is to show that limitations can have good results. This, by the way, is why there are so many different kind of people on this side of the aisle. Even in the little group that I'm usually dealing with, which is Comicsgate, you have people who are here because they're patriotic and they think that the basic fundamental ideas I expressed before about the American way of living is true because they accept those limitations. There are people here who just want to defend their country and who post things over and over again about the fact that we should have secure borders. What are secure borders? They're a limitation. There are people here who have a morally significant way of looking at the world, which is what? It's placing limitations, which hopefully should be based upon reality. But again, it's limitations. You have people here who want to go back to the old way of storytelling, which is what? It's rife with limitations. You have people here who just want the canon to be respected, which is what? It's placing limitations on current stories. You have people here who just want a good story, which is what? Which is dealing with the limitations that you have in telling your story, and if you want to make it an expert story, using those limitations to tell a better story. And that's the second reason of why I'm doing all of this. Because if you want to be a good writer, recognize your limitations and use them to your advantage. Don't, like these quote-unquote progressive people, try to hide the fact, try to run from the fact, try to destroy the fact that there are limitations on what you're trying to do. And people tell me all the time, oh, you're just being derivative of this, that, and the other thing. And I'm going, yeah, I'm learning from the masters how to do this. I accept that old Sibylline premise of the origin of wisdom is to first recognize that you know nothing. That is one massive limitation to place upon yourself, but that is the way that we actually move forward into a future where not only we can begin once again to hopefully discuss things rationally, but where we can once again foster a society that produces master storytellers. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, you're looking at some of the beautiful art through this entire video from my graphic novels in the background. If any of that looks appealing to you at all, click on those links in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. And for the CROM the Destroyer early bird sign-up page, if you sign up there, you will be informed when the project goes live and get a free exclusive pinup poster with your order. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.